Hello everyone. So like many of you out there, possibly most of you out there, it's proved to be very disappointing to hear so many poor reviews of Ridley Scott's latest film, Napoleon. I was looking forward to going to see it at the cinema, but just completely put off now. So I'm not going to review the film for you. Haven't seen it. Probably what I'll do is when the director's cut is released on DVD, which apparently is going to be done in the next few months, I'll buy that and just have it in my DVD collection and watch it then. But it certainly doesn't sound like it's worth paying the price of cinema admission to go and see it. But as I say, I can't review the film, but I've been very interested in all the comments so far on YouTube, not just from wargamers obviously, but from people with an interest in history and the history of the era, and also just people interested in cinema and in Ridley Scott's work and so on, to listen to their opinions. But I wanted to sort of share my thoughts on the subject of historical accuracy in films, and also the whole broader topic of what actually is history with you. So here we go. So I put these, first thing I've done is put these 3 DVDs out on the desk, just to remind people that Ridley Scott is a really good director. These are 3 of his better films, and this one in particular, The Duelist, is interesting, I think, in the current context, that I think this was Ridley Scott's first film, certainly one of his earliest ones, and it's set in the Napoleonic era. It's based on a short story by Joseph Conrad, and it's just a delight. The whole film is an absolute delight to watch. It's visually appealing, the story is engaging, the acting is excellent, everything about it is superb. So it shows, that Ridley Scott is capable of producing a film set in the Napoleonic era that is worth going to see at the cinema. The thing that the Duelist is lacking, that Napoleon obviously has in spades, is the epic spectacle, the large scale battles and reenactments of Waterloo and Austerlitz and all that kind of thing. There is combat and conflict in the Duelist, but it's on a much smaller scale. Most of it, being the actual fighting that takes place between the 2 protagonists in the film. But there's also occasional scenes set on the retreat from Moscow, for instance, that kind of thing. But it's a much smaller scale and has much sort of smaller scope. It's more to do with the actual irrational antagonism that occurs between the 2 main characters of the film. And then of course you've got films like Alien, which isn't a historical film at all, so there's no problem with historical accuracy. And I don't believe Alien is actually based on a book, so you don't even have the problem of is it true to the script of an original novel or something like that. I can't tell you about The Duelist in that respect. As I say, it was based on a novel, a short story by Conrad, but I've never read it, so I can't tell you how closely they stick to the plot of the story. And then you have Gladiator, which is set, in a historical period, sort of fictitious story, but it features historical characters such as Commodus, who is played by the same actor who plays Napoleon in the latest film, Joaquin Phoenix. And that takes me on to the next thing that I wanted to say really about, how we approach history and historical accuracy in films. Gladiator was a great success. People have obviously pointed out the historical inaccuracies in Gladiator, but there hasn't been anything like the fuss that's being made over Napoleon. I mean, there are some blatantly, inaccurate scenes in Gladiator. I mean, not the least being that the Emperor Commodus is killed in Gladiator by the Russell Crowe character in the arena. In fact, he was emperor for about 13 years. Marcus Aurelius chose him as to be his successor. In the film, Commodus actually kills Marcus Aurelius simply because he hasn't nominated him as his successor. And in real life as well, as I say, not only was Commodus chosen, despite his obvious inadequacies, he was chosen to be Marcus Aurelius' successor, but he died. He was on the throne for 13 years. He ruled for 13 years and was actually killed in his bath in the end, not in the arena. So he had a much longer reign than is featured in the film Gladiator, and died in a totally different way. But people don't get so worked up about it. And why is that? I think the main reason is people aren't quite so invested in that period of ancient Rome as they are in the whole Napoleonic era. Napoleon is still a hotly kind of debated personality in history. He had a remarkable impact on later events. He definitely changed the course of history in his career and changed the map of Europe. And from the point of view of British historians, there's always been a tendency to demonise him for a number of reasons. I mean, not only were we at war or sponsoring other nations to be at war with him for well over sort of 20 years, but and we felt sort of threatened. He did threaten an invasion of the British Isles at one stage. So he's always been portrayed as a very almost demonic character, and in later years likened to Hitler, although there was absolutely no, the only similarity between Napoleon and Hitler was the fact that they overran so much of the European mainland and threatened invasions of Britain. But they're very different characters. But nevertheless, Napoleon has often been twinned with Hitler. I mean, I live in Plymouth, and Napoleon was actually brought to after he'd been captured after the Battle of Waterloo. After the 100 Days, he was actually surrendered to the British in the western side of France. He surrendered to a naval officer whilst making an attempt to get the ship to take him to America. But he was brought to Plymouth, and crowds flocked to see him. He was a very popular character, wasn't regarded with the hatred that historians have tried to describe, and another aspect of that which has lingered on the radio recently. A BBC radio presenter was talking about the release of the latest film, but she actually described Napoleon as a diminutive character. This is another thing that is another falsity that has, found its way into, British history books, and people take as being the truth, that he was of very short stature. But that was just the way that cartoonists portrayed him at the time. He was short by modern standards, but not by the standards of the day. I think he was about 5'4", something like that, which was an average sort of height for people in that period. He was actually taller than Nelson, and yet you never hear people describe Nelson as being diminutive. It's simply a throwback to those days when the popular press in Britain were trying to diminish Napoleon's prestige and character by making him appear as a little bit stunted and tiny in comparison to British heroes like Wellington. So I think we have to sort of take a step back really from all the fuss and remarks that have been being made about the film. I mean, I've absolutely no doubt that it is appallingly inaccurate, and also I strongly suspect that it's not a very good film. So it fails on both those two issues. I wonder whether it will get nominated for any Oscars or receive any. I'll be interested to see. But I think most of the criticisms are coming at it, from the point of view of being totally invested in getting at the accuracy of the period, of it being portrayed accurately. And I'm not just talking about things like uniforms or sort of dates and place names and personality names being accurate, but also all kinds of details, like the British being in trenches at the Battle of Waterloo, and that's really what I'm trying to get at here, is put yourself in Ridley Scott's mind if you can. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that there was a certain amount of vanity in this project. That lots of film directors in the past have thought about, Stanley Kubrick being one of them, have thought about making a film about Napoleon and failed. And Ridley Scott's, I think, has got a little bit kind of conceited over the years. He is quite justified in being proud of his earlier works, like films like this. But I think Napoleon is a little bit of a vanity project in a way. But at the same time, when you put yourself in that mindset, what was he actually trying to do with the film? I don't think in any way, shape or form he was trying to make a historically accurate film. He had a historical consultant, I forget the guy's name now, Michael Brers or something like that, helping him, but he really used the historical consultant's advice very sparingly, and often ignored it. So the consultant would point out to him that things like, this didn't happen, that didn't happen. Wellington and Napoleon never met, and had conversation and all this kind of thing. But I don't think it was important to Ridley Scott, that didn't happen. What he was trying to, portray was something a little bit different. I suspect. I don't know. I think he was trying to on the one side portray things that could have happened, that they didn't happen, but they could have happened. They could have happened in that way, and in another is to give the modern day audience an insight into the Napoleonic era by making things happen that might have happened in the modern day. So, I mean, I haven't expressed that very well, but to get back to this point about trenches at Waterloo, trench warfare is, really didn't begin until later in the 19th century, and was fully, developed obviously in the First World War. But there you have the connection that Waterloo is in Flanders. I mean, I don't think certainly armies marched over the battlefield at Waterloo, but I think it was always behind the German front line during the First World War. But Flanders, was completely crossed by trenches on both sides and so on. So maybe there's a reference to the World War One in that, the fact that the geography is, it's the same place geographically, and it was the British, digging the trenches in Flanders. So, maybe he's getting at that. I don't know. I think you have to sort of cut, whilst criticising the film, which is perfectly, understandable. I think you have to give Ridley Scott a little bit of slack in what he was trying to portray. I mean, another scene, is apparently there's a scene where Napoleon fires some artillery at the top of the one of the Great Pyramids in Egypt, and that never happened. But there is some suggestion that the Sphinx lost its nose because the French artillerists took pot shots at it and damaged it. So it's that whole kind of way that Ridley Scott has chosen to portray Napoleon's egotism and his belief in himself as a great military strategist and tactician and general, and he knew he was making his mark on history, and in exactly the same way as Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and so on had made their mark on history. He was fully conscious of his own posterity, and having a scene where he actually leaves a mark on one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, is symbolic. It's a good symbolic portrayal of that kind of attitude. But you have to get away from thinking that Ridley Scott was in any way concerned with making a historically accurate movie. I don't think he was, and I think he was concerned with making a good film, and unfortunately it looks like he might have failed in that. I mean, apparently, is it Vanessa Kirby who plays Josephine? She may well get good good reviews and even an Oscar nomination or so for her portrayal. But I think overall the film is going to be a little bit of a disappointment, not only to us war gamers, but to historians in general, and maybe to the film-going audience who have, and this takes me on to my next point, is that the film-going audience can't be expected to have any, real kind of understanding or knowledge of history. They will have a kind of rough idea, but a lot of them, most of them probably wouldn't even tell you which century, the Napoleonic Wars took place in. But having been to see films like Napoleon, unfortunately what happens is that people learn their history in that way. So they learn an inaccurate history. So I'm going to take you on to some other DVDs that I have here now to give you examples of that point. The film Braveheart, which is a portrayal of William Wallace, the Scottish hero, absolutely and completely historically inaccurate. In particular, his love affair with Queen Isabella, didn't happen. But there's even a suggestion in the film that Wallace makes Isabella pregnant because her husband Edward II is clearly not interested in women in the film, possibly because he had so many male favourites, that caused a bit of a scandal, but not a bit of a scandal, a tremendous scandal during his reign. It's often been suggested that he was homosexual. So the director of Braveheart has played on that and, portrayed Wallace as being the person who Isabella falls in love with and possibly gets pregnant by. And the implications of that, of course, are that Isabella's son, Edward III, was a remarkably strong and able king and warrior leader of the English, especially during the 100 Years' War. So the implication of that is that William Wallace's genes, macho genes, got into the royal lineage and supplanted Edward II's kind of rather weak and feeble genetics, but completely wrong. But a lot of people believe that now. Especially in Scotland. I think it's in Inverness. There's actually a statue of William Wallace that has Mel Gibson's likeness. It's been taken far too literally as historical truth, Braveheart. So this is another thing we have to be wary of. There's a couple of other films here. One being another one starring Mel Gibson. Now, again, this has taken a lot of stick from historians, and in particular from military historians, and war gamers, that kind of thing, people who are interested in the American War of Independence, because of the way it portrays. I can't remember what the battle is, but it's a completely inaccurate portrayal of the battle in exactly the same way that Ridley Scott's portrayal of some of the battles in Napoleon are totally wrong, and the Patriot took stick for that. But I really, really love this film. I think it's absolutely great, and the only reason is, I'm not too bothered that the battles aren't right and don't look right. It's got a good plot, it's got a good story. It engages you. You want to see how Mel Gibson triumphs over over his adversary, the sort of wicked British general, and so on. And I think it's a really good film, and it's well acted, and well filmed. It's got all those glaring historical errors in it, but so Ridley Scott could have pulled it out of the hat, I'm saying, if Napoleon had had that going for it, but by all accounts it doesn't appear to have. Another film which is most war gamers will really quote as one of their all-time favourite films is the film Zulu. There's hardly an inch of the reels which has any accuracy in it whatsoever. Its portrayal of the fighting at Rorke's Drift during the Anglo-Zulu War, it gets just about everything wrong, and yet it's just such a stirring, wonderful film to watch. And again, most people who don't really have any knowledge of history will take this version as being the truth, which is something that upset a lot of the descendants of some of the principal characters, such as Hook, who won the VC at Rorke's Drift. He was a very teetotal Christian disciplinarian kind of character, who was still remembered at the time of the making of the film, was still remembered obviously by his grandchildren and so on. And in the film it's portrayed as a drunken, insubordinate, I think Michael Caine's character, Bromhead, describes him as a barrack room lawyer. Completely the opposite. But that's just one of many errors in the film. I could go on. I think I have in a previous video many years ago now about the errors in inaccuracies in the way Zulu is portrayed. But it is. Just such an engaging, gripping film that you love it regardless of all that kind of thing. It even inspired someone like Ian Knight, who saw it as a boy. Ian Knight's about the same age as me, to go on and study history and the Anglo-Zulu War, in particular. And he's written dozens now of academic books that perfectly stand up to scrutiny, that kind of thing. So it is possible to be inaccurate. It's not obligatory to stick to historical reality in films, and sometimes we get upset by inaccuracies and sometimes we don't, and it just strikes me as that Ridley Scott has been unfortunate to have trodden on the toes of so many people who are totally, committed to their own version of what happened, why it happened, and so on. And I don't think he cares too much that he's trodden on those toes. And I think people are quite justified in being upset and so on, but they have to sort of, as I say, take a step back and look at it from the other point of view and ask themselves whether it's a good film. And I don't think it is. I'll finish just with this other Ridley Scott film here, which is not one of Ridley Scott's best. But in terms of the storyline and the acting and so on, it's not bad. I mean, for some reason, Russell Crowe adopted a very peculiar accent, but he had his reasons for doing that. He got quite upset when people, I forget the critic's name in particular, but someone interviewed him and asked him why he adopted an Irish accent, and he walked out of the interview live on radio, because he was so annoyed by this remark that he wasn't trying to speaking an Irish accent at all, but he was trying to adopt a kind of not folksy, but a kind of a common, generic, lower class kind of accent. He was trying to portray Robin Hood as I know he wasn't a historical character, but he was trying to portray him more as a person, a man of the people, rather than as being a disinherited nobleman, which some of the stories have Robin Hood as. But there is an absolutely appalling scene at the end of this film where the French. I've heard people describe it as a reverse D-Day. The French actually land on the underneath the White Cliffs of Dover in what almost looked like the medieval equivalent of the D-Day landing craft, that landed on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. But again, I absolutely hate that scene. I think it's totally ridiculous, and it's got some things that clearly would never have happened. But that brings me back to this whole point about the way Ridley Scott approaches this kind of thing. He's not interested in historical accuracy. He's got two very symbolic kind of items in that scene. He's got the landing barges, so he is trying to show, that the French invaded England. That is true at the time of King John. That certainly happened. It didn't happen in the way he shows, but he's trying to connect with the modern day audience who are familiar with battles that took place in the 20th century and so on, and are aware of of how the Channel could be crossed and so on. So he's not only showing that, but he's also showing it happening underneath the White Cliffs of Dover, which are like the iconic symbol of the sort of fortress Britain, as it were. So from a director's point of view, you can see what's going through his mind. You might not necessarily appreciate it. You might not necessarily, think that it makes for a good cinema. But if you do take that step back, I think you can kind of look and analyse what was going through Ridley Scott's mind and what he was trying to say to you as a modern day cinema goer, not as a potential expert on warfare in a particular era, or as a historian or amateur historian or armchair historian or whatever. So I've gone on long enough. That's the end of my thoughts on the release of Napoleon. I certainly won't be going to see it in the cinema. So obviously I wouldn't recommend other people to go and see it if they haven't done already. Based on what I've heard of it, I might change my mind when I see it on DVD, but I'm not going to risk investing in a cinema ticket. As I say, I'll wait, and maybe next year sometime I'll come back to you and give you another update on what I actually thought of the film. Bye for now.